I want to get to the Golshani Raz, but before we do that, let's maybe spend a little bit more time speaking about Afghanistan. And in addition to the sort of Sufi teachers you met with, these profound solitary saints, what about ordinary Afghan people who maybe are suffering? What sort of spirituality was maybe palpable for you in that context, given taking into account the sort of diverse influences that you're likely encountering, foreign and domestic and so forth? Did you sense that that this spiritual dimension of Islam, of Sufism, is somehow affecting the entire culture?
Well, yes. There's no place like Afghanistan. There's no greater friends of God, and there's no greater Satans to find in one and the same country. These are people of extremes. And I had traveled a great deal on sailing ships and have been to many countries and seen many dangers, many adventures, and I have seen no adventure like Afghanistan. And one of the great adventures in Afghanistan is to live in the moment. The people are, not everyone, these are all different people, as I say, but the friends of God are numerous. They're simple people. Those of you who have heard me give interviews, you know that I always emphasize how amazing the spirituality of the villagers of Afghanistan, simple people. And they don't have to be villagers. I don't mean that they necessarily must be so, but there's the beauty of not just Islam, but the beauty of the varieties of Sufi expression that blossomed in Afghanistan. They still permeate the culture despite all of the destruction, despite all of the outside influences, all of the need that often leads to treachery and deceit on the one hand, but the same need leads to profound acts of generosity. In The Spy of the Heart, I mentioned Abdul Hayy Darr. So those of you who hear his last name, you understand that he's like, he's a nobleman from the Uzbek tribe. You see, he's a big Zadeh. And, but he was the son of a farmer. But I always thought of him as a prince, like his name, because he absolutely was a prince. He was far superior to myself in terms of his ethics and his concern. And so when we would travel, and there were many like him, of course he was killed protecting others. Meaning that the problem in war is that good people, they give their lives. They give so much that they end up even giving their lives. And but among the rural people, there is a profound kindness and hospitality and generosity. At the time that I was there, I went back in 2004, looking for the people I knew. I went to the villages, in the rural areas, and things were the same. When I was in the cities, things were different. Things had gone downhill, let's just say that. But in the villages, it was the same. Go to the villages. I used to take off on horseback away from my protectors just so I could be alone with the villagers to see what they would do. Because if I went with Abdul Hayy Darr or somebody like that, they always treated me specially, so the villagers knew that I was some kind of exotic person. And I wanted to see what the villagers would do if they didn't know who I was. And they had no idea who I was. The villagers have no idea. Those villagers, many of them had no idea what the United States was. once we were stopped when I worked for the UN, and these people that stopped us, they had never heard of the United Nations. And I was trying to explain to them who the United Nations was. This is in Faryab province in 1990. But they have, despite the simplicity, lack of education, they have what I mentioned very often. What I learned from them was tawakkul and sabr. And I had very little of either of those qualities, see. So to travel for months with Afghans who will hike for 14 hours a day and then stop in the evening to have a bowl of the simplest kind of soup and some bread that you throw in and soak up, and that's all you have, and maybe that's all you're going to have. To sleep in places that are lice and flea infested and complain hardly at all. See, this is the nature of spiritual people. They have, it's very easy to read about spirituality. It's very hard to practice spirituality. And these people, many of them, they were raised in an atmosphere of respect and kindness and concern. And of course, if it doesn't stick, the same culture will give rise to a powerful demon who will use the system and become a tyrant or a usurper or a murderer. And that's why in Afghanistan it's so exciting, because you don't know for sure if you're going to live till nightfall. You might live till nightfall. I always did the ablution every day. I wasn't a Muslim. I thought, well, if I die, I should be washed. So I would, even though I wasn't saying the prayers with the Muslims, I was still doing the ablutions. And I thought really that nobody knows. We don't know. We saw yesterday some people died. Yesterday they hit a mine. They became sick, and so many tragedies. But God guides whoever He wishes through this. You see, so the people are profoundly. Almost every Afghan from, say, my generation, which there's several people here like Wafi John and Hamid John and others, older Afghans, they know that in Afghanistan, almost everyone has a Sufi connection. Whether or not they practice Sufi spirituality, that's a different matter, but everyone has a linkage to somebody in the spiritual tradition. Despite the heart, I didn't write about everybody, but Wafi John is my witness. I was the student of his uncle. I was the disciple also of his uncle, Ibrahim John, who was a Sufi. And he was Qadiri, and he had other affiliations. He played music. He taught me to play music, made me play music and sing with them so we could go into special states playing music. See, so I have other stories I didn't write about, but they're right here in America. I met Wafi John's uncle at Mansehra up in northern Pakistan, and became friends right away, and we stayed friends all through his life. And when Wafi John was younger and I was younger, Wafi John would see me with his uncle, and he knew that I had a special connection to your uncle. And his uncle goes back generations of Sufis from this. See, so anybody who knows Afghanistan, they know that the whole culture is saturated with Sufi viewpoint. And then, of course, the outsiders come in and they say, this is wrong. You must not pray at the tombs of these spiritual teachers. We're going to destroy these tombs so that you don't have a temptation to pray at these tombs. You should learn how to correctly pronounce these verses of the Quran. You should learn how to pray properly, see. But the old tradition of Afghanistan is based on love and the most astonishing generosity and friendship. Like Wafi John's uncle, Ibrahim John, he is the living manifestation of the true friend. No matter what you approach him with, no matter what state you are in, no matter what your need is, he will accommodate you. Am I right? Didn't matter. You need money, you need advice, you need a friend. It doesn't matter. Some Jehovah's Witnesses came to see him. I was at his house in Centerville. He invites them in. He says, "Oh, we have guests." He invites them in, and they say, "We want to talk." He says, "Wait, we have hospitality." So there's tea and food made, and it's brought. This is going on for hours, and he says, They say, "We want to tell your religion." He says, "Well, yes, of course. Tell me about your religion." And they spend all this time talking, and he listens, and he's smiling the whole time. And afterwards, he waits a very long time, and then he says, "This is excellent. Now I want to tell you about my religion." And I watch as after a while they just realize they're not getting anywhere, and they're supposed to. I don't know how many houses they're supposed to visit that day, but they don't flee, but they have to kind of find an escape to get out of the house. You see. But he never a moment of disrespect, never a moment of cynicism. See, I was very cynical watching all this, and Ibrahim John was never a moment unkind or judgmental or cynical of these people. He thought these are lovely human beings. They're visiting. They want to visit my house. They're honoring my house. We must make them some food. We must give them some hospitality. Oh, they want to tell us about their religion. We will listen to them. And then now, maybe they'll listen to us too, see? So it's come to America. See? These people have come to America, and then they pass away here, because they get older. It goes back to the Hanif, who was in the Quran. And as you recall, the Hanif is Abraham. And the Hanif is not concerned about what the people of his own tribe or even his own family are doing. The Hanif is just turning inside towards God and is trying to find a way to know God. And the Hanif shows up in the Sufi tradition among the Malomati and the Ubaisi traditions, because those which co-evolved, incidentally, the Ubaisi and the Malomati tradition, they stress the idea of being very quiet and not very showy about spiritual merit or attainment, and they have a sincerity that one can sense immediately, and usually they have a bit of magnetism that's, I'm sure you're familiar with this term of jazba, so they have some jazba. Anyway, Ustad Khalili had all of these qualities, and I was very drawn to his poetry, and so it was a very lucky and wonderful thing to actually meet him in 1986 in Islamabad, and to know him for the last phase of his life, really less than a year of his life that was left, and to know him during that time, and then for him to give me indications of where to go next. So I first go to Peshawar in 1986. As I said, I'm a carpenter. I was vacationing in Turkey. There were some Afghan Turkomans weaving rugs, tokats, and we became friends. And I took back some of the carpets right here in the Bay Area, sold them, sent them the money. Then they send me about 18 rugs, and I have to start sort of Tupperware parties to sell the rugs. And this sort of mushrooms a bit. And one day, Hashim Udkan from the United Nations calls me at my boat shop and asks if I'm Robert Darr, and he said that he's very impressed with my project in Turkey. And I assure him that we have no project in Turkey. And he tells me not to be so modest, that he's himself spoken to the refugees. And in fact, the refugees are not happy with many of the projects, but they are happy with our project. And I said, I cannot accept his offer to go to Islamabad. So I refused. And then a week or two later, my school burns, as it happens. And my dear friend dies in the fire. I'm talking, of course, about my dog, who happens to be locked in the boat shop at the time. I do have a teenage daughter at that point, but she's a lot less attached to me than my dog was. See, because dogs are very emotional creatures who don't know what you're doing if you leave. And I was telling Zachary here that I talked it over with my daughter and said, look, I'm going somewhere, maybe I could get in big trouble, you know. And she said, you really want to go, Daddy, go ahead and do it, you know. What I mean is that after the fire, I thought, well, we'll see what happens. And sure enough, he called me back. Hashim Khan said, I'm calling you again. I ask you again, will you come to Islamabad? And I said, well, yes, now I will, because my circumstances have changed. And that's how I went to Islamabad and to Peshawar. And next thing I know, we've got 2 offices there, one in Quetta and one in Peshawar. And I realized I must have no Europeans or Americans to prevent me from learning the language, so I only live with Persian-speaking people. So that I learned, of course, fairly quickly how to get along, and then I start reading more profoundly into the literature. And it's at this juncture that I meet Ustad Khalili, and he dies in 1987 in the spring. And we have several meetings, and that's all, just several meetings in his life, that's all it takes. You would say, well, you have such an attachment for a person you only knew for several meetings. I said, yes, when the fruit is ripe, it falls easily from the tree. It just takes one little breeze to drop it. So it was at that moment in my life. And he suggested that I go into northern Afghanistan to certain places. And he indicated there were certain people that I might like to meet there. And so, of course, I was doing aid work, and so I planned journeys by horse and walking through Afghanistan into the north. And those I've mentioned, I've written a book. I happen to notice there's a copy of it here. It's called The Spy of the Heart, those of you who haven't seen it. If you speak Spanish, you can read it online. The whole thing is online if you speak Spanish. The publisher didn't want me to leave the whole English up online, so you can only read the first 4 chapters for free. But I described some of these journeys. Let me say, though, I tend to ramble, so I hope if I'm going too far, you just butt in and cut me off here. But the question was about the teachers, and the thing I'm trying to emphasize is that life is mysterious, and we don't really know what's going to happen. I knew I loved the poetry and the teachings in the poetry, and I didn't know how I was actually going to be joined with that. But what I learned is that when I went to the large assemblies of highly organized dervish orders, which I did. There's a lot that I didn't write about in The Spy of the Heart. Very, very many different meetings with different Sufis, Sufi groups, dervish groups. It didn't suit me, which doesn't mean there was anything wrong with those groups. I tend to be a loner anyway, so I think that really I had a profound appreciation for the mystic who needs no support is what we're talking about. A person like Ustad Khalili, like Jamaluddin Qazi Sahib, who is mentioned in The Spy of the Heart, and like Ustad Ras Muhammad Zareh, who I met not long after I had converted to Islam, which I waited until 1991 to do. even though I thought about it since 10 years earlier. So again, it was an individual, a person who actually does not seem to be connected on the face of it with a great tradition, but who has a profound presence, spiritual presence, and who is able to tune in directly to one's personhood and offer the right kind of advice and the right kind of guidance. And so this is the path. The people that I studied with, they were all of this kind. They were the solitary ones, sometimes called the afrod, you see. Not necessarily in the hierarchical sense of the meaning of that term, but rather that they are the ones, they're the hanifs, they are the people. They tend to be very broad-minded. They tend not to, they tend to put jazba above doctrine. In all the cases that I studied with, they were Muslims. They were practicing Muslims, and if anything, they exceeded the worship and devotion of the ordinary fard requirement of Islam. They were fasting more, doing more prayers. Don't count me in on that, because I can barely do the fundamental requirements. I'm talking about these wonderful individuals. I'm a Muslim, and it's a lovely religion. It's a profound, beautiful religion that allows one to bring the body and the heart and the insight together, and in a manner that makes spirituality more possible. It may not result in spirituality if there's an imbalance anywhere, but it has great possibility and potential for spirituality, and that's why it has such a vast spiritual heritage and tradition. So I'm very, very satisfied and delighted and grateful that I found my way into Islam. On the other hand, as I say, these individuals and therefore the teaching that to some extent I also represent is ecumenical, broad-minded, tolerant. Necessarily so, because the spirituality dissolves fixations and conviction. Spirituality expands intimacy and compassion and caring for another, and trying to see the luminosity in any tradition that can bestow that, and to not become dogmatic and narrow-minded. So anyway, this is the path that I followed, and the teachers I followed were few that I actually apprenticed with. And the longest apprenticeship I had was with Ustad Abdul Hayy Darr, which I guess was almost 20 years I was his student.